Picture this. A man stands in a field outside Prague, and the soldiers assigned to kill him won't look at his face. They're professionals, mercenaries who've drowned villages and hanged children. But something about this particular execution makes their hands shake on the crossbow stocks. Maybe it's the empty socket where his left eye used to be, weeping pus down a scarred cheek. Maybe it's the way he stands perfectly still, head tilted slightly, listening to their breathing even though he can't see them anymore. The right eye went dark 3 months ago. Now he navigates by sound, by smell, by the texture of fear radiating off men who've never learned to hide it properly. The autumn wind carries the stench of the plague pits beyond the city walls, bodies stacked like firewood, rotting in the October heat that refuses to break. He can smell it on the wind, sweet decay mixing with wood smoke from the peasant hovels. Somewhere a dog barks. Closer, a horse stamps nervously, armour jingling. The soldiers shift their weight. Leather creaks. One man's breathing catches in his throat, almost a sob. He's unarmed. They made sure of that. Stripped him of the warhammer that shattered skulls at Witkov Hill, the mace that painted Prague's cobblestones with German blood. But even blind and weaponless, he makes them nervous. Professional killers, terrified of a blind man in his 50s whose body is failing faster than his enemies ever managed. The commander finally speaks, voice tight. Jan Žižka of Trochnov, you stand accused of heresy, rebellion and crimes against the Holy Church. Do you have final words? The blind man smiles. It's not a pleasant expression. Tell your bishop something, Žižka says, his Czech thick with the peasant accent he never bothered to refine. Tell him I've beaten 5 crusades. Tell him I've killed more knights than the plague. Tell him when I'm dead my bones will still win battles. The commander signals. 10 crossbows rise. But here's what makes this moment echo through 6 centuries. The execution never happens. Not this time. Not yet. Because even Žižka's enemies have learned a terrifying truth. Killing him might be more dangerous than letting him live. His army doesn't need him to see anymore. They need him to exist. A blind general who wins every battle becomes something worse than a man. He becomes proof that God fights for heretics. The crossbows lower. The commander's jaw works silently. Prague's gates creak open behind them. How does a village priest's son, half blind, then fully blind, then dead, defeat the combined military might of Christian Europe? How does blindness become a weapon sharper than any sword? And what kind of monster do you create when you teach peasants they can butcher the nobility and call it holy work? This is not a story about overcoming disability. This is a story about what happens when competence mutates into something the system can't control, when the revolution you started decides you're not revolutionary enough, and when victory becomes so absolute that even death can't stop the killing. The year is 1424, Bohemia is burning, and the most dangerous man in Europe can't see the flames anymore, but he can smell them, and he's learned to love that smell. 30 years earlier, Jan Žižka stood in the village square of Trochnov and watched the church burn his neighbours alive. They'd committed the crime of reading scripture in Czech instead of Latin. Peasants weren't supposed to understand God's word directly. That was the clergy's monopoly, the key to their power. But someone had smuggled a translated gospel into the village, and 3 families had gathered in a barn to read it by candlelight. Someone informed. The church never forgave information breaking free. The execution was efficient. No elaborate ceremony, no chance for martyrdom speeches. The bishop's men simply nailed the barn door shut and set it ablaze. Žižka was 18, already broader than most men would ever grow. Hands calloused from farm work his minor noble birth didn't quite excuse him from. He stood with the other villagers and listened to the screaming. The smell of burning flesh has a sweetness to it that nothing prepares you for. It gets into your hair, your clothes, you taste it for days. His father, a small-time noble barely distinguishable from wealthy peasants, grabbed his arm when Žižka moved toward the barn. "Don't," he hissed. "You can't help them. You'll just burn with them." Žižka watched the roof collapse inward. Sparks fountained into the grey Bohemian sky. The screaming had stopped. That was somehow worse. "Then what's the point?" Žižka asked. His voice was quiet, but something in it made his father's hand drop away. "What's the point of God if this is what his servants do?" According to witnesses, he walked away from Trochnov that night with nothing but the clothes on his back and a simple conclusion forming in his 18-year-old brain. Mercy was a luxury for people who didn't live under the church's boot. power was the only language the bishops understood, and if peasants wanted justice, they'd have to take it with their hands wrapped around something heavier than prayer beads. He headed for the Teutonic frontier. The church might burn heretics, but they needed soldiers for their endless wars against pagans in the Baltic. If he was going to learn violence, he might as well learn from professionals. The Teutonic Knights were the most disciplined killing force in Europe. German efficiency applied to holy warfare. Their fortresses rose from the wilderness like stone prayers, and their discipline turned war into something almost beautiful. Formations that moved like single organisms, supply trains that never failed, siegecraft that reduced rebellion to mathematics. Žižka spent a decade with them, started as infantry, worked his way to sergeant, learned that warfare wasn't about individual heroism, but about systems. The knights were nearly unbeatable not because of their armour or their faith, but because they'd industrialised violence. Every man knew his position, every order was executed without question. Doubt was a disease they'd learned to amputate. But the Teutonic Order had a weakness, and Žižka absorbed the lesson like gospel. Heavy cavalry was magnificent right up until it wasn't. Put them on open ground against undisciplined peasants, and knights were angels of death. But funnel them into narrow terrain, disrupt their charge, make them fight on foot, and suddenly the armour became a tomb. Weight that made them invincible became weight that made them immobile. Historians still debate whether Žižka actually fought at Tannenberg in 1410, where the Polish-Lithuanian alliance shattered the Teutonic Knights' myth of invincibility. Records are murky, but whether he was there or heard the stories afterward, the battle rewired his understanding of warfare. At Tannenberg, 20,000 knights charged into a forest of Lithuanian spears and Polish artillery. The flower of German chivalry drowned in mud and blood. The Teutonic Order never truly recovered. If Žižka fought there, he fought on the losing side, and that made the lesson even sharper. He returned to Bohemia in 1420 as something different than what had left. The farm boy who'd watched his neighbours burn was gone. In his place was a professional soldier with a simple, dangerous understanding. Nobility was a lie, knights weren't invincible, and peasants with discipline could butcher the ruling class if someone taught them how. All he needed was a cause worth killing for. Prague was about to give him one. The city buzzed with a new kind of rebellion, not peasants demanding bread, but intellectuals demanding God. A preacher named Jan Žižka stood in pulpits and said the unsayable. The church was corrupt, the pope was not infallible, salvation didn't require Latin or golden reliquaries. Hus preached in Czech. He said ordinary people could read scripture themselves. He said the bread and wine should be shared with everyone, not just priests. The church called it heresy, the people called it liberation. Žižka, pushing 40 now, heard Hus preach once. Stood at the back of the church, he always chose positions near exits, old military habit, and listened. Hus wasn't promising heaven, he was promising dignity. The radical idea that Czech souls mattered as much as German ones, that God spoke Czech as fluently as Latin. When the church burned Hus at the stake in 1415, they created exactly the martyr they'd feared. Bohemia exploded, not in riots, in revolution, and revolutions need generals. Žižka was ready. He'd been ready since that barn burned in Trochnov, but revolutions are hungry things. They devour the people who feed them. And Žižka was about to learn that winning was more dangerous than losing, that blindness could sharpen vision, and that the peasants he armed would eventually need his blood to stay satisfied. The war was coming. So was his transformation into something history still doesn't have proper words for. The morning of July 15th, 1410, Žižka woke to the sound of 27,000 horses stamping in darkness. He was 30, fighting as a mercenary in the Teutonic Order's baggage train. Unglamorous work, but the Order's logistics were worth studying. They didn't just wage war, they engineered it. Supply depots positioned with geometric precision. Even religious fervour had bureaucratic efficiency that turned faith into administrative procedure. That morning, near Grunwald and Tannenberg, all that Prussian organisation was about to collide with Polish rage and Lithuanian cunning, fighting on their own soil. The Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, had arrayed his forces beautifully. 40,000 men, heavy cavalry front and centre, plate armour catching early light like mercury. Behind them, infantry blocks with German precision. The Teutonic banners snapped in wind, black crosses on white fields, dominance made cloth. The Polish-Lithuanian forces looked like chaos by comparison. Their lines wavered. Lithuanian cavalry wore leather and fur, barely civilized in Teutonic eyes. King Władysław II Jagiełła commanded with what looked like hesitation. Von Jungingen saw weakness. He ordered the charge. And that's when Žižka learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes weakness is bait. The sound of that many horses charging is geological, pressure you feel in your chest before it reaches your ears. The ground shook. Dust turned morning into twilight. Teutonic knights lowered lances with synchronized precision, a guillotine falling toward Polish lines. The Polish front wavered, then broke. Men scattered. The Teutonic cavalry punched through exactly as trained. Glory, God, and German superiority confirmed. Except the Lithuanian cavalry hadn't broken. They'd retreated deliberately, drawing the charge deeper. And behind the fleeing Poles, fresh formations waited, along with something the order hadn't accounted for: artillery. Historians still debate whether the bombards at Tannenberg changed the outcome decisively, but Žižka remembered the sound forever. Primitive cannons firing into armoured cavalry at close range. Screaming, horses and men indistinguishable. Knights in full plate became statues when mounts died beneath them, toppling into mud that swallowed them like mouths. The Teutonic charge had become a trap. Žižka watched from the baggage lines as battle dissolved into slaughter. The order's cavalry, spread thin by pursuit, found themselves surrounded. Polish infantry swarmed isolated knights, dragging them down through weight of numbers. Peasants with hammers smashed through armour joints. Daggers found eye slits. The invincible became the immobile, became the dead. Von Jungingen died somewhere in that chaos, still fighting, still believing God favoured discipline over cunning. 200 Teutonic commanders died with him. The order lost nearly 20,000 men. Žižka survived because he wasn't important enough to die gloriously. Baggage soldiers ran when formations collapsed. He ran with them, but slowly, watching over his shoulder, cataloguing lessons. Heavy cavalry needs space. Deny the charge, and armour becomes liability. Terrain matters more than courage. Peasant infantry can kill knights if you teach them where to strike, and guns, unreliable in 1410, but that sound of metal balls punching through plate. That was the future arriving. He returned to Bohemia thinner, poorer, infinitely more dangerous. The Teutonic Order had taught him discipline. Tannenberg taught him how to break it. For the next decade, Žižka drifted through Central Europe's small wars. He fought for minor nobles, guarded caravans, killed men for money and felt nothing. Morality had burned in that Trochnov barn. What remained was competence, patience, and crystallizing understanding that warfare was mathematics wearing glory's costume. He lost his left eye sometime during these years. Sources conflict. One chronicle says arrow at a siege, another claims tavern brawl. Žižka never discussed it. The socket became infected, filled with scar tissue. He adapted, learned to compensate for lost depth perception, turned his head more when fighting. The injury should have ended his career. Instead, it sharpened focus. With one eye, he couldn't afford distraction. He saw less, so he learned to see better, reading terrain with scout's precision, assessing formations for weakness like a craftsman examining wood for flaws. By 1419, Žižka was 50, old for a soldier. Most veterans his age had retired to minor posts, training young men to die in wars, old men declared. He should have faded into obscurity. Then Jan Hus burned, and Bohemia exploded, and suddenly Prague needed a man who understood war wasn't about honour, it was about making the other side die for theirs. They found Žižka in a tavern, drinking cheap wine with his remaining eye closed, listening to revolution beginning in the streets outside. When the Hussite delegation asked if he'd lead their forces against the Holy Roman Emperor and 5 Crusades worth of Catholic Europe, he opened his eye and smiled. Finally, he said, real work. He had no idea the real work would cost him everything, including the second eye, his soul, and eventually his skin. But by then, losing things had become his specialty. Jan Hus died screaming on July 6, 1415, and the sound echoed across Bohemia like a bell nobody could unring. They burned him in Constance, at the council that was supposed to reform the church. Hus had gone under safe conduct from Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund himself, a promise that lasted exactly as long as it took bishops to get nervous. The church offered recantation. Hus refused. They chained him to a stake, piled wood around his legs, and set him ablaze while singing hymns. According to witnesses, Hus sang psalms back until smoke destroyed his lungs. His last words gasped through fire, "Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me." The church thought killing him would end the problem. Instead, they created Bohemia's first martyr for an idea that terrified Rome, that ordinary people could talk to God without paying priests to translate. Žižka heard about the execution 3 weeks later, and his reaction was practical, not theological. He didn't weep or rage, he calculated. A martyred intellectual was worth 10 living ones. The church had just handed Bohemia a saint and a cause. The revolution needed only teeth. Prague became a powder keg wrapped in prayer. Hus's followers, Hussites now wearing the name-like armour, began organising, not just intellectually but militarily. They knew what came next. The movement split immediately. The Utraquists wanted modest reform, communion in both kinds, check preaching, but keep the social order intact. The nobility could support that. It didn't threaten property rights. Then there were the Taborites, named after the fortress town where they gathered. The Taborites wanted something far more dangerous: actual equality, no bishops, no feudal hierarchy, common property, the kingdom of God on earth, achieved through fire if necessary. They weren't reformers, they were apocalyptic communists with Bibles. Žižka looked at both factions and chose the radicals. Historians still debate whether this was genuine belief or tactical calculation. Did Žižka embrace Taborite theology or simply recognise that moderates don't win wars? The radicals had hunger, they had nothing to lose, and men with nothing to lose followed orders without hesitation that got armies killed. By 1419, Žižka had become the Taborites' general, not through appointment, but through the fact that when he spoke about warfare, men who'd never held weapons suddenly understood how to kill. He assessed Bohemia's strategic problem with mercenary clarity. They were surrounded. Holy Roman Empire to the west, Hungarian Catholics south, Polish uncertainty north, and inside Bohemia, half the nobility was Catholic and terrified. The Hussites had no heavy cavalry. That required noble breeding and wealth. No professional armies. Those cost money the movement didn't have. What they had was numbers, rage, and a one-eyed veteran who'd watched Teutonic knights bleed at Tannenberg. Žižka's solution was elegant and brutal: turn Bohemia's peasants into a mobile fortress. He started with wagons, farm carts, reinforced with iron plates and wooden shields. Each wagon held a dozen men with crossbows, pikes, early firearms. Chain the wagons together in a circle, a wagenburg, and peasants suddenly had cover, firing positions, structure that turned cavalry charges into suicide. The nobility laughed. Hiding behind wagons? Where was the glory? Where was honour? Žižka's response: glory is for the dead, we're here to win. He drilled peasant soldiers with Teutonic discipline, taught them to move wagons as single units, trained them to fire in volleys, reload in rhythm, hold position when knights charged instead of breaking. He didn't ask for courage. Courage was unreliable. He demanded obedience because obedience could be trained. And he taught them something the church would never forgive: that nobles bled exactly like peasants when you stabbed them in the right places. The first test came July 30th, 1419 at Prague's New Town Hall. Hussites demanded prisoner release. The Catholic Council refused. Žižka was there. Sources aren't clear if he led the assault or simply failed to stop it. The mob stormed the building, found the councillors, threw them out windows onto pikes and swords of the crowd below. 7 men died screaming, bodies lifted and displayed like captured flags. This was Prague's first defenestration, throwing people out of windows, and it started a war that would drown Central Europe in blood for 15 years. King Wenceslaus IV died of shock when he heard. His death left the Bohemian throne to his half-brother Sigismund, the same emperor who'd promised Hus safe conduct and watched him burn. The Hussites said collectively, no. Europe said, this ends now. Pope Martin V declared a crusade, not against distant Muslims but against Christians reading the wrong books in the wrong language. 5 crusades would follow. 500,000 soldiers would march into Bohemia carrying papal banners and promises of salvation for killing heretics. Žižka prepared his wagons and sharpened his men's discipline, and knew exactly how this ended, with him swimming in blood, because that was the only language empires understood. What he didn't know yet was that the Hussites would eventually fear him more than the Crusaders did, that victory would isolate him faster than defeat, that he'd lose his remaining eye and keep fighting, and blindness would somehow make him more effective, more terrifying, more useful. The Preacher King was dead. The useful monster was about to be born. And Bohemia would learn that monsters, once created, are very difficult to unmake. The morning of July 14th, 1420, 150,000 men surrounded Prague, and Žižka had 9,000 defenders who'd never fought a real battle. Emperor Sigismund's First Crusade arrived like locusts, stripping countryside bare as it advanced. German knights, Hungarian cavalry, papal mercenaries carrying banners blessed in Rome. They came to crush heresy and remind Bohemia that reading scripture in your own language carried consequences measured in mass graves. Sigismund's strategy was simple: starve Prague into submission, then execute Hussite leadership publicly enough to scare survivors into orthodoxy. Medieval shock and awe, proven effective for centuries, but Sigismund made a critical miscalculation. He assumed Žižka would defend Prague's walls, fighting traditional siege warfare that favoured the attacker's numbers. Žižka had no intention of playing traditional rules. Witkov Hill rose northeast of Prague like a tumour, steep, rocky, strategically irrelevant by conventional wisdom. It overlooked the city but was too isolated to defend long-term, too exposed to hold against determined assault. No military manual recommended fortifying it, which is exactly why Žižka did. He took his wagons, peasant soldiers, and 300 fighters he trusted most, and fortified Witkov's summit, built wooden palisade reinforced with the wagon fortress, positioned his few bombards to cover approaches, then waited. Sigismund looked at that hill and saw insult. A one-eyed mercenary squatting on worthless ground, with farmers playing soldier, daring Catholic Europe to do something about it. So Sigismund sent his best, Hungarian heavy cavalry and German infantry, supported by crossbowmen. Not his entire army, that would be overkill. Just enough overwhelming force to crush heretics quickly. July 14th, 1420, dawn broke hot and still. The kind of heat that makes armour feel like an oven, sweat pooling in every joint, breath coming shorter with each uphill step. The assault began with crossbow fire. Bolts whistled up the slope, thunking into wood shields, occasionally finding flesh. Hussites hunkered behind wagons and didn't return fire. Žižka had drilled that discipline into them. Don't waste ammunition on ranging shots. Wait until you can smell their breath. Hungarian cavalry came next, trying to charge uphill over broken ground. Tactically insane, but they were knights. Glory demanded the attempt. Horses struggled on rocky slope. Formation broke apart. By the time they reached the wagon line, the charge had degraded into individual knights arriving piecemeal, exhausted. Žižka's peasants met them with pikes and war flails, agricultural tools repurposed for crushing skulls through helmets. A knight on flat ground was a killing machine. A knight on broken ground, separated from his unit, winded. Just a man in a metal suit too tired to defend himself. The Hussites learned something glorious that day. Nobility died screaming exactly like peasants when you caved in their helmets with threshing flails. German infantry came next, expecting to find wagon fortress weakened. Instead, Hussite crossbowmen and the first effective use of handguns, primitive firearms wildly inaccurate but making sounds that terrified horses and shattered morale. The noise was apocalyptic, guns roaring, men screaming, metal on metal creating shriek that burrowed into brain, smoke from gunpowder and blood stench creating fog that turned battle into hell's anteroom. Historians still debate whether Žižka's tactical genius or Sigismund's incompetence decided Witkov Hill. Probably both. Žižka had chosen terrain that neutralized cavalry and turned defensive position into killing funnel. Sigismund had underestimated peasant discipline and overestimated noble courage. By midday, Crusaders withdrew. They left 300 dead, mostly nobility and professionals, against Hussite losses of perhaps 30. The mathematics of warfare had inverted. Prague erupted in celebration. Church bells rang. The impossible had happened. Heretics had beaten a crusade. And somewhere in that victory and chaos at the wagon line, something struck Žižka in the left eye socket. Sources conflict on what. An arrow shaft deflecting off helmet rim, a sword fragment catching orbital bone, a crossbow bolt punching partway through but not reaching brain. Žižka never explained. What's documented is aftermath. Infection. Medieval combat meant every wound came pre-poisoned with filth, rust, body fluids. Žižka's eye socket became a nest of pus and necrotic tissue. The eyeball itself began to rot in its cavity. There was no antibiotics, no real surgery beyond cauterization. The best physicians could do was pack the wound with wine-soaked cloth and hope infection didn't reach brain. Žižka lost the eye, the socket filled with scar tissue weeping perpetually, giving his face perpetual asymmetry that made looking at him uncomfortable. Half his vision gone, depth perception destroyed, skills he'd spent decades perfecting suddenly compromised. He was 51, half blind, leading an army that had just won the impossible, and Prague treated him like a hero saint, which was exactly the moment Žižka should have recognized the trap. Revolutions don't reward heroes, they consume them. The same people cheering his name today would need his blood tomorrow to keep the movement pure, to prove their revolutionary credentials, to feed the insatiable hunger radical politics always develops. But Žižka was still high on victory, still believing competence and ruthlessness could protect him from machinery he'd helped build. He didn't yet understand that every battle he won made him more indispensable and therefore more dangerous to his own side. The Crusaders would keep coming, his remaining eye would fail, and the Hussites he saved would eventually realize that a general who couldn't lose also couldn't be controlled. Victory at Vítkov Hill proved peasants could defeat crusades. Now Žižka just had to survive the reward. The problem with winning once is that everyone expects you to keep winning forever. After Vítkov Hill, Hussites across Bohemia looked at Žižka's wagon fortress tactics and saw salvation. The revolution metastasized from Prague into countryside, and everywhere it went people demanded the tactics that had worked. Žižka obliged. But teaching peasants to kill nobility wasn't like teaching them to farm. It required breaking instincts bred into them for generations. The wagon fortress, the Wagenburg, became the center of Hussite military doctrine. But building one wasn't enough. You had to move it, defend it, attack from it. Turn farmers into mobile army that could outmaneuver professionals while maintaining iron discipline under cavalry charges. Žižka spent 1421 drilling his forces with brutality that shocked even supporters. Men who broke formation were beaten. Deserters were hanged publicly. He didn't ask for loyalty. Loyalty was emotion. He demanded obedience because obedience kept you alive when knights charged. The wagons evolved, reinforced with iron plating, modified with firing slits at multiple heights, connected with chains that could be locked or unlocked rapidly, allowing sections to open for cavalry sorties or close for defense. Each wagon carried supplies for a week. Inside each wagon, crossbowmen, pikemen, handgunners working in rotation. Crossbowmen fired first, providing cover. Pikemen held gaps where cavalry tried to break through. Handgunners, armed with primitive firearms that misfired half the time, fired into massed cavalry at close range, where accuracy mattered less than noise and psychological impact. Historians still debate whether Žižka invented these tactics or simply perfected existing concepts. What's undebatable is that he industrialized warfare in ways Europe hadn't seen since Rome. Every wagon crew knew their position. Every soldier understood firing sequence. Chaos became choreography, and it worked, terrifyingly well. At Kutná Hora in December 1421, Sigismund's forces trapped Žižka's army against frozen River Elbe. The Crusaders had numbers, 30,000 against Žižka's 12,000. They had cavalry, they had tactical advantage. Žižka formed his Wagenburg on the ice. When German knights charged, horses slipped on frozen surface. Formation collapsed. Hussite crossbow fire punched through plate armor at close range. Not always fatal, but enough to wound, to make men fall, to create obstacles that tripped horses behind them. Then Žižka opened sections of wagon line and sent his own cavalry through. Not noble knights, but mounted infantry on small horses who harassed German flanks and withdrew before counterattack could organize. The crusade broke. Thousands died on that ice. Sigismund retreated, leaving behind armour, supplies and corpses of nobility, who charged wagons believing God favoured courage over mathematics. But here's what legends don't mention. Žižka's right eye was failing. Cataracts, probably. Or damage from infection that destroyed the left eye, spreading to the remaining one. Sources from 1422 describe Žižka squinting constantly, needing information repeated, holding written messages close enough to touch his nose. By autumn 1422, he could barely see shapes. By winter, the world was shadows and light. By early 1423, Jan Žižka, the most feared commander in Central Europe, was completely blind. It should have ended his career. Medieval warfare required vision, reading terrain, watching enemy formations, judging distances. A blind general was an oxymoron. Instead, Žižka became more effective. He compensated by developing command structure that turned blindness into organizational advantage. He appointed trusted officers as his eyes. They described terrain in precise detail. They reported enemy movements using standardized terminology he'd drilled into them. They became extensions of his tactical thinking. And Žižka's hearing sharpened. He learned to identify unit types by movement sound, heavy cavalry's thunder versus light infantry's rustle. He could estimate distances by echo, judge army size by collective noise of thousands trying to stay quiet. His other senses compensated. He smelled battlefields, fear sweat versus blood stench, acrid gunpowder, copper tang of mass death. He felt vibrations through ground, sensing cavalry charges before they were visible. But the real advantage was psychological. A seeing general could be deceived by false formations, visual tricks. Žižka couldn't see any of that. He operated purely on verified intelligence, scout reports, officer descriptions, mathematics of logistics and positioning, and the terror factor. Crusaders were already afraid of Žižka. Now they faced a blind general who kept winning. It broke something in their understanding. How could a man who couldn't see predict their movements? How could he outmaneuver sighted commanders? The answer: he'd reduced warfare to pure system. Vision was a distraction. What mattered was information flow, discipline, and willingness to make decisions without emotional hesitation. But each innovation made Žižka less man and more weapon. His officers reported directly to him, bypassing political commissars and Hussite ideologues. His army obeyed him with religious fervour. Literally, some Taborites believed his blindness was divine, God taking his eyes so he could see strategic truth. The revolution had created a monster it couldn't control, and revolutions hate what they can't control. By late 1423, Žižka wasn't just fighting Crusades. He was fighting other Hussites, moderates who wanted compromise, radicals who thought he wasn't radical enough, political factions that saw his blind, unstoppable military machine as threat to their power. Victory had become poison. The wagon tactics that saved Bohemia made Žižka indispensable, and indispensable people are dangerous, because you can't replace or remove them without admitting you need them. The Crusaders kept coming, the Hussites kept fracturing, and Žižka, blind and increasingly isolated, kept winning battles while losing the war for his own soul. He taught heretics to butcher knights. Soon he'd have to teach them to butcher each other. The morning of March 25th, 1423, Žižka couldn't see the 15,000 Crusaders marching towards Sudomierz, but he could hear his officers' fear. "They outnumber us 3-1, his second-in-command reported, voice tight. "Hungarian heavy cavalry on both flanks, German infantry in centre, papal banners. This is Sigismund's best." Žižka sat motionless on his horse, face turned towards sounds his scouts described. Empty eye sockets hidden behind leather mask he'd started wearing. Partly practical, partly psychological warfare. The mask made him look inhuman. Soldiers crossed themselves when they saw him. "Terrain," Žižka said. His voice had developed a flatness, emotion burned away by blindness. "Open field mostly, some marsh to the east, low ridge where we're positioned." "The marsh, how wide?" "Maybe 200 paces, reeds thick enough to hide a man." Žižka smiled behind the mask. "Then we'll make them think we're hiding men there." What happened at Sudomierz wasn't battle, it was systematic slaughter dressed in tactical brilliance. Žižka positioned his Wagenburg on the ridge, exactly where Crusader scouts would expect. Visible, apparently vulnerable. The wagons formed a defensive circle, peasant soldiers clearly visible, looking nervous. Every piece screamed, "We're scared and waiting for you to attack." But behind the ridge, invisible to approaching Crusaders, Žižka had positioned a second wagon formation, and in the marsh he'd sent men hours before dawn, not to fight, but to make noise, banging shields, shouting orders, creating acoustic impression of hidden ambush. The Hungarians heard the marsh sounds and diverted cavalry to investigate. Standard tactical response, exactly what Žižka expected. The German infantry, seeing Hungarian cavalry peel off, advanced without flank support. Standard Crusader arrogance, except Žižka's wagons weren't waiting passively. As Germans closed to crossbow range, Žižka's lead wagons suddenly unlocked and rolled forward down the ridge. Not defensive position, attacking fortress, gravity and momentum, turning carts into battering rams with crossbowmen firing from moving platforms. The Germans, caught mid-advance, tried to form defensive lines. Too late. The wagons crashed into their formation like agricultural equipment, redesigned by someone who understood physics and hated nobility. Men disappeared beneath wheels. Others were crushed between wagon sides. Behind the first wave, Hussite cavalry emerged. Light, fast, armed with flails and warhammers. They swept through gaps, targeting German officers identifiable by better armour. Kill the commanders, and medieval formations collapsed. The sound was industrial, metal on metal, bones breaking with wet cracks, men screaming in German, Czech, Hungarian in pure animal terror that transcended language. Gunpowder smoke mixed with blood spray created fog that turned battlefield into abattoir. Žižka sat on his horse behind lines, receiving reports every 30 seconds. German centre collapsing. Hungarian cavalry still in marsh, found nothing. Our loss is minimal, maybe 50 wounded. He processed information with machine efficiency. When Hungarian cavalry finally extricated themselves and charged the wagon line, Žižka had already repositioned reserves to create L-shaped formation. The Hungarians charged into crossfire, crossbow bolts and handgun fire from two directions. Horses screamed and went down. Knights in full plate hit ground hard enough to break bones through armour. Hussite infantry swarmed them with hammers, targeting joints and helmet visors. No mercy. No prisoners unless they were worth ransom. By afternoon, the crusade had shattered. 15,000 men reduced to scattered units fleeing across Bohemia. Žižka's forces pursued for miles, cutting down stragglers, capturing supplies, collecting armour to melt down. Hussite casualties, maybe 200 dead, 300 wounded. Crusader casualties, 5,000 dead, thousands more captured or wounded. Entire supply trains seized. It was the most lopsided victory yet, and it happened under command of a completely blind general who'd orchestrated the entire battle through verbal reports and mental mapping of terrain he'd never seen. According to witnesses, when officers reported victory, Žižka showed no emotion. He simply asked, "Survivors?" Some fled south. Maybe 8,000 made it out. "Then we haven't won," Žižka said. "We've just delayed the next attack." That night in captured Crusader camp, Hussite soldiers celebrated with wine and looted food. They sang hymns, defiant religious songs about communion in both kinds and reading scripture in Czech. The hymns mixed with drunk laughter. Žižka sat alone in his tent listening to celebration and felt nothing. Historians still debate whether Sudomierz represented Žižka's tactical peak or whether blindness actually enhanced his command abilities. What's undebatable is that after Sudomierz, his own forces started to fear him as much as the Crusaders did. A blind man shouldn't command armies. A blind man shouldn't outmaneuver sighted opponents. A blind man shouldn't orchestrate victories that looked increasingly like something beyond human capability. The Taborites whispered that God had taken Žižka's earthly sight to give him divine vision. The moderates whispered that Žižka had made a deal with something darker. The Crusaders stopped whispering. They simply ran when they heard his army was approaching. But victory at Sudomierz created a new problem. Žižka had proved Hussite forces didn't need God's favour or military genius. They needed his system, and systems can be replicated, taught, distributed to commanders who still had their eyes and weren't so conveniently blind to political reality. The revolution was fracturing. The Utrechists wanted peace with Rome. The Taborites wanted apocalypse. and Žižka, blind and increasingly isolated, represented a third faction. Professional soldiers who didn't care about theology, only winning. 3 factions, 1 small country, and a blind general who'd become too dangerous to kill but too powerful to ignore. The Crusades would keep coming, but the real slaughter was about to turn inward. The problem with revolutionary armies is they eventually run out of external enemies and start looking inward. By late 1423, the Hussite movement had fractured into factions that hated each other almost as much as they hated Rome. The Utraquists, moderate reformers backed by nobility, wanted compromise with Emperor Sigismund. Limited church reform, recognition of Czech communion practices, but preservation of social hierarchy. Peace, before Bohemia bled dry. The Taborites wanted no such thing. Compromise was surrender. They'd tasted what equality felt like when peasants butchered knights, and they weren't going back. Žižka found himself trapped between factions, trusted by neither, needed by both. The Utraquists feared him because his army was too radical, too effective, too independent. He'd created military force that answered to no nobility, followed no feudal obligations, dangerous precedent. Today they fought Crusaders. Tomorrow they might decide Czech nobles weren't much better than German ones. The Taborites feared him because he wasn't ideological enough. Žižka fought for tactical reasons, not theological. He didn't care about biblical interpretation. He cared about logistics, discipline, killing efficiently. That made him useful but unreliable. Both sides wanted to control him. Neither could. The crisis came in spring 1424, near Malešov. The Utraquist faction had opened negotiations with Sigismund, discussing terms, what reforms Rome might accept, what compromises might end the war. To the Taborites, this was heresy worse than anything Rome had done. Žižka received delegations from both sides within hours of each other. The Utraquists sent nobleman Čeněk of Wartenberg, who spoke in careful diplomatic language about necessary accommodations. He wanted Žižka's army to stand down, give peace a chance. The Taborites sent radical priest Ambroj, who quoted scripture and called the Utraquists Judases. He wanted Žižka's army to march on Prague and purge the moderates before they could betray the revolution. Žižka listened to both. His blind face betrayed nothing. Then he made the decision that transformed him from general to monster. "We march on Prague," he told his officers, "but not for the Taborites, for ourselves." What followed was Žižka turning his military machine against fellow Hussites with the same cold efficiency he'd used against Crusaders. His army moved fast, wagon fortress rolling across Bohemia, not conquering territory but establishing dominance. He didn't attack Utraquist forces directly. He simply positioned his army to make negotiation impossible, occupied key roads, seized supply depots, made clear that any peace treaty would go through him first. The Utraquist nobility mobilized their own forces to stop him. These weren't Crusaders. These were fellow Czechs, fellow Hussites, men who'd fought beside Žižka against common enemies. The Battle of Malešov, June 7, 1424, was fratricide dressed as military necessity. The Utraquist army outnumbered Žižka's forces, but numbers meant nothing against wagon tactics. He positioned his Wagenburg on high ground and waited. The Utraquist commanders, noble-born, traditionally trained, tried orthodox tactics. Cavalry charges, infantry assaults, everything that had failed for years. The result was massacre. Czech nobility dying to Czech crossbow bolts. Hussite war hymns sung while Hussite soldiers killed each other. The revolution devouring itself with industrial efficiency. Žižka showed no hesitation. His officers reported that he commanded the battle exactly like any other. Coldly, precisely, adjusting tactics based on enemy response. The fact that the enemy spoke Czech and prayed to the same god made no difference to the mathematics of killing. By afternoon, the Utraquist army had broken, hundreds dead. The nobility's attempt to control Žižka's military machine had failed bloodily. But the real horror was psychological. Žižka had just proved he'd kill fellow Hussites as readily as Crusaders. The revolution's most effective general was now its most dangerous loose element, a blind warlord commanding an army that answered only to him. According to later accounts, a captured Utraquist officer was brought before Žižka after Malešov. The man reportedly asked, "How can you kill your own people?" Žižka's response, "I kill anyone who stops us from winning. "You stopped being my people when you started negotiating surrender." The officer was executed, no trial, no debate, just efficiency. Historians still debate whether Malyshev was justified defense of revolutionary principles, or the moment Žižka became exactly what the revolution feared: a military strongman using ideology as excuse for personal power. What's undebatable is the result. The Utraquist faction's political power collapsed. Negotiations with Sigismund stalled, and the Taborite radicals realised they'd created a general they couldn't control. Žižka had saved the revolution from compromise, but in doing so, he'd proved he was willing to kill it to keep it pure. And revolutions that eat their own rarely stop at one meal. The Crusaders were still coming. The Hussites were now fighting civil war, and Žižka, blind and increasingly isolated, had burned his last bridge to political legitimacy. He'd become pure function, a killing system wearing human skin, so effective at violence that even his allies were terrified. The next crusade would be the largest yet, and Žižka would face it knowing his real enemies might be standing beside him. Between 1420 and 1431, 5 crusades marched into Bohemia. 5 times the combined military might of Catholic Europe assembled to crush heretics. 5 times they broke against Žižka's wagons like waves against stone. The numbers were absurd. Conservative estimates put total Crusader forces at over 500,000 men across all campaigns. The Holy Roman Empire, Hungarian Kingdom, Polish mercenaries, papal forces, German principalities, even England sent observers. This wasn't warfare, it was industrial-scale religious cleansing. Žižka's forces never numbered more than 20,000 at peak, usually less. Peasant armies supplemented by minor nobility, armed with whatever they could scavenge or forge. By every military calculation, Bohemia should have been annihilated. Instead, the Crusades became object lessons in how doctrine and discipline beat numbers and nobility. After Malyshev, Žižka didn't wait for the next crusade. He took the wagon fortresses mobile, raiding into Moravia, Silesia, even Bavaria. Not to conquer, but to demonstrate that heretics could strike imperial heartlands with impunity. The raids were terrorizing. Hussite forces would appear outside German towns, wagon fortresses rolling across countryside like mobile sieges. They'd offer terms, pay tribute or be sacked. Town after town chose tribute. The ones that refused were made examples, not through random violence but systematic destruction that left buildings intact but populations decimated. Historians still debate whether Žižka personally led these raids while completely blind. Sources conflict. But whether he commanded directly or his system operated without him, the result was the same: Bohemian heretics dictating terms to German imperial territories. The psychological impact was devastating. For centuries, European warfare had followed certain rules. Nobility fought nobility. Peasants were victims or expendable infantry. The social order was maintained even through violence. Žižka's Hussites ignored all of it. They killed nobles and peasants with equal efficiency. They treated warfare as mathematics, not theatre. They elevated based on competence, not birth. And they were proving, battle after battle, that their system worked better than feudal hierarchies. The Battle of Usti nad Labem, June 16, 1426, became the symbolic moment when Crusader morale finally shattered. German and Hungarian forces, 70,000 strong, trapped a Hussite army of 25,000 against the Elbe River. The tactical situation was impossible. Hussites had river at backs, Crusaders between them and safety, overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The Crusaders began assault at dawn, confident this was finally the decisive victory. The Hussite commanders formed wagon fortresses in interlocking layers, creating defensive depth that turned riverbank into killing funnel. As Crusaders advanced, they compressed into narrower frontages, exactly what Žižka's system was designed to exploit. The sound reached towns 10 miles away. Continuous roar of hand-gone fire, screaming men and horses, rhythmic crash of war flails crushing armour. The Crusaders kept throwing men into the wagon fortress, expecting weight of numbers to break through. It never did. By afternoon, the Elbe's banks were carpeted with corpses in Crusader colours. German knights face down in mud. Hungarian cavalry horses broken and screaming. Papal mercenaries who'd been promised salvation, finding only Czech crossbow bolts. The Crusaders broke, not retreated, broke. panicked rout that turned withdrawal into stampede. Hussite cavalry pursued for miles, cutting down fleeing soldiers who threw away weapons trying to run faster. Casualties: Hussites maybe 2,000, Crusaders over 15,000, with thousands more captured or drowning in the Elbe. It was the last time a crusade seriously threatened Bohemia's heartland. After Usti, the pattern was set. Crusader armies would assemble, march into Bohemia, encounter wagon fortresses, suffer catastrophic casualties, retreat. The Crusades became increasingly half-hearted, commanders knowing they marched toward defeat but unable to admit it publicly. But every victory isolated Žižka further, though by Usti he'd been 3 years in his grave. His final campaigns, in months before his death, were characterized by increasing paranoia and isolation. He trusted fewer people, consulted less with Taborite political leadership, made unilateral decisions that his army followed unquestioningly, but that terrified civilian authorities. According to witnesses, in his last battles Žižka would sit on his horse in complete silence for minutes, head tilted, listening to sounds only he could interpret. His officers would wait, barely breathing, for the blind general to issue orders that somehow always anticipated enemy movements no scout had reported. Was it military genius, divine inspiration, or had Žižka simply reduced warfare to such pure system that blindness enhanced rather than hindered command? The Taborites didn't care. They were terrified. Their most effective weapon was a blind man they couldn't predict, couldn't control, couldn't kill without making him a martyr. By autumn 1424, Žižka commanded the largest Hussite army, roughly 18,000 men who followed him with religious fervour that had nothing to do with theology. They followed him because he kept winning, because following orders kept them alive, because the alternative was being on the receiving end of his tactics. But Žižka was tired, 55 years old, blind, body failing from decades of violence and infection. The revolutionary fire that had burned his neighbours back in Trocnov had gutted him from inside, leaving only competence and will. He'd defeated 5 crusades, he'd killed more knights than plague, he'd turned peasants into the most feared fighting force in Europe, and he'd become exactly what the church said he was, a monster who perverted natural order, who made nobility bleed like common men, who proved that systems built on birth were no match for systems built on discipline. Europe's military spine had broken. But so had Žižka's humanity. What remained was function without feeling, a general who couldn't see, commanding armies that couldn't lose, fighting wars that couldn't end. October 11th, 1424. Jan Žižka died in a camp outside Přibyslav, killed by something no crusader ever managed: disease. Not heroically, not in battle, not leading one final charge. He died in a tent that smelled of shit and rot, body failing from plague or dysentery, sources conflict, while his army waited outside wondering if the monster could die from something as ordinary as infection. The plague had been spreading through Central Europe for months. It didn't care about military genius or revolutionary fervour. It killed indiscriminately. Peasants, nobles, blind generals who'd defeated 5 crusades. Žižka's officers tried to keep it quiet initially. The army's morale was built on his invincibility. Admitting he was dying from disease, not enemy action, felt like admitting the universe had a sense of irony. But you can't hide a general dying slowly. The sounds leaked out. Retching, fevered shouting, wet coughing that meant lungs filling with fluid. The smell leaked out too, body evacuating itself from both ends, medicinal herbs burning to mask death. According to later accounts, Žižka remained conscious almost to the end, lucid enough to issue final orders, practical ones. Nothing about legacy, just tactical instructions for his officers on maintaining the wagon fortress system, handling political factions, preventing the army from fragmenting. One officer reportedly asked, "What should we tell the men?" Žižka's response, "Tell them I died. Tell them the system works without me. Tell them anyone who tries to become what I was needs to be killed immediately." Even dying, he understood the trap. He'd become indispensable, and indispensable people warp everything around them. The revolution needed his tactics, not his personality. His final gift was trying to make himself irrelevant. It didn't work. He died sometime in the night, Sources say between October 11th and October 12th, 1424, 55 years old, blind, body consumed by disease that turned him into a hollowed-out shell. The Hussite commanders faced immediate problem. What to do with the corpse? Great men received great burials in medieval Europe, tombs in cathedrals, monuments inscribed with deeds, but Žižka had spent his life destroying that hierarchical system. Putting a peasant general in a noble tomb would pervert everything he'd fought for. Yet he'd also become something more than human in his soldiers' minds. Letting him rot in unmarked grave felt like surrender. They tried to bury him quietly in a small church in Čáslav. Simple grave, no monument. But the legend was already mutating, taking on life independent of the corpse. Stories spread that Žižka's body wouldn't decay, that his flesh remained incorrupt, proof of divine favour. Other stories claimed he'd been buried with his warhammer, and the hammer glowed at night. Complete fabrications, but revolutions need myths more than truth. And then came the drums, the most persistent legend, recorded in multiple sources though historians still debate its veracity, that Žižka requested his skin be used to make drums for Hussite armies, that even dead, he would lead them into battle through the sound of his own flayed hide stretched over wooden frames. It's possibly apocryphal. The story doesn't appear in records until decades later, but it spread because it perfectly encapsulated what Žižka had become, a man so consumed by warfare that his body itself became weapon, continuing to terrorize enemies posthumously. Whether the drums existed or not, Crusader forces certainly believed they did. Reports from the late 1420s mention German soldiers panicking at the sound of Hussite drums, convinced they were hearing Žižka's dead skin. The psychological warfare was perfect. The blind general had become a ghost general, simultaneously dead and immortal. But here's the brutal truth the legends obscured. Žižka dying was the best thing that could have happened to the revolution. While he lived, he was bottleneck. Every major decision went through him. His blindness made him dependent on officers, but it also centralized command in ways that made the movement fragile. Kill Žižka, and theoretically, the system collapsed. His death proved otherwise. The wagon fortress tactics spread. Other commanders, Prokop the Great, dozens of lesser-known leaders, adopted and adapted the system. The Hussite military machine continued grinding through Crusades without its architect, which meant everything Žižka had sacrificed, his eyes, his humanity, his political legitimacy, had been to build something that didn't need him. He'd been useful, but not necessary, indispensable right up until the moment he died, and everyone discovered they could proceed without him. That's the thing about revolutionaries who become systems. The system survives, the revolutionary becomes footnote. Žižka had spent his life teaching peasants they could kill nobles. His death taught them they could kill memories too, reshape history to serve whatever narrative the current faction needed. The man who died retching in a plague tent became the immortal warrior who fought from beyond the grave. The real Jan Žižka disappeared into legend, and legends are easier to control than living monsters who might disagree with how they're being weaponized. The Hussite wars would continue another 7 years. The Crusades would keep coming and keep failing. Bohemia would eventually negotiate the compromise Žižka had killed fellow Hussites to prevent. And through it all the drums would beat. Whether made of Žižka's skin or ordinary hide, whether myth or truth, it didn't matter. The sound was enough. The memory was weapon. The corpse was more useful than the man had ever been alive. The years after Žižka's death were perversely the Hussite movement's most militarily successful period. Prokop the Great, called the Shaven for his tonsured priest's haircut he never abandoned, took Žižka's wagon fortress system and weaponized it further. If Žižka had been defensive genius, Prokop was offensive terror. He took mobile fortresses and turned them into invasion platforms. Between 1426 and 1431, Hussite armies didn't just defend Bohemia, they raided deep into Germany, Poland, Hungary, even reaching the Baltic coast. Not conquest campaigns, demonstration raids, proving heretics could strike anywhere and conventional armies couldn't stop them. The beautiful rides, they called them, spanile jizdi. Beautiful because they returned laden with plunder and prisoners, and everywhere they went the drums sounded. Whether actually made from Žižka's skin or not, most modern historians consider it myth, the psychological impact was real. German chroniclers recorded that Hussite drums caused terror and despair among defending forces. Soldiers would abandon fortified positions rather than face the approaching wagon fortresses. The legend of the dead general became more useful than the living one ever was. Žižka alive had been problematic, blind, uncontrollable, politically dangerous. Žižka dead and mythologized could be whatever current leadership needed. Divine instrument, revolutionary martyr, proof that God favoured the Hussite cause. But here's where it gets darker. The very success Žižka's system enabled also contained the revolution's self-destruction. By 1431, the Hussites had defeated 5 Crusades. They'd raided across Central Europe with impunity. They'd forced the Catholic Church to negotiate as equals. They'd achieved military dominance that seemed impossible, and they had absolutely no idea what to do with that victory. The Taborite radicals wanted permanent revolution, continued warfare, complete destruction of Catholic hierarchy, apocalyptic communist paradise. The Utraquist moderates wanted what they'd always wanted: modest church reform and return to normal life. The soldiers who'd followed Žižka wanted to survive. They'd spent years living in mobile war camps, following wagon fortresses across battlefields, becoming professional killers. Peace meant returning to peasant life that no longer fit them. They'd seen nobility bleed like commoners. They couldn't unsee that. Žižka had created a military machine that worked too well. It proved peasants could defeat crusades, which meant the social order was a lie. But revolutions that prove the social order is a lie can't easily rebuild functioning societies afterward. In 1431, the Council of Basel opened negotiations with Hussite representatives. The Church, finally accepting it couldn't militarily defeat Bohemia, offered compromise. The 4 Articles of Prague, Hussite demands for Czech communion practices, freedom to preach, limitation of church property, would be partially recognised. It was exactly the compromise Žižka had fought against, exactly the half-victory he'd killed fellow Hussites at Malešov to prevent. But Žižka was dead, and the movement was exhausted. 15 years of warfare had bled Bohemia. The Crusades had failed, but they'd also devastated countryside. Crops unplanted, villages abandoned, generations dead in battles that ultimately achieved modest reforms that could have been negotiated in 1420. The Taborite radicals rejected compromise. They prepared for continued war, convinced they were betraying Žižka's legacy by negotiating. The Utraquist moderates, backed by Bohemian nobility who'd regained influence, accepted. They needed peace more than ideological purity. At the Battle of Lipany, May 30th, 1434, the Hussite movement finally completed the self-destruction Žižka had begun at Malešov. Moderate Hussites allied with Catholic Bohemian nobles fought against radical Taborites in civil war that killed more Czechs than most crusades had. Prokop the Great died at Lipany, along with most Taborite leadership and the last remnants of the radical dream. 13,000 men died that day. Hussites killing Hussites. Using Žižka's tactics against each other, wagon fortresses turned inward on their creators. The revolution devoured itself with the same efficiency it had devoured crusades. The Basel Compacts were signed in 1436. Bohemia received its modest reforms, communion in both kinds, some church property redistribution, recognition of Czech practices, the kind of compromise that in 1415 might have prevented Jan Hus from burning and the entire war from happening. 21 years, 5 crusades, hundreds of thousands dead. Bohemia devastated. And the result was exactly what moderates had wanted from the beginning. Žižka's system had worked perfectly. His tactics had proven unbeatable. His legacy had terrorized Europe, and it had all been for compromise that made the radicals' deaths feel like historical waste. The drums stopped beating. The wagon fortresses were disassembled. Professional soldiers who'd followed Žižka became bandits, or returned to peasant life, or hired themselves out as mercenaries, teaching other armies the tactics that had made them famous. And Jan Žižka himself, the one-eyed, then blind, then dead general who'd defeated 5 crusades, was remembered exactly the way he'd feared, as useful myth, not complicated man. The corpse had kept fighting long after the man died, but even corpses eventually stopped being useful. Jan Žižka's grave in Jaslav disappeared. Not immediately, not dramatically. It simply faded from memory as the centuries passed and Bohemia moved on from the Hussite wars. The church where he was buried was renovated, rebuilt, eventually replaced. Records were lost or destroyed. By the 17th century, nobody could definitively say where Bohemia's most effective general was actually buried. His bones, like his revolution, vanished into historical ambiguity. But his name became monument. Statues appeared, Žižka on horseback, warhammer raised, face stern and heroic, eyes fully functional in bronze even though the real man spent his most effective years completely blind. The statues made him noble, tragic, inspirational. Everything the actual mercenary peasant general wasn't. Prague erected the largest equestrian statue in the world on Vítkov Hill, the site of his first major victory. 30 feet of bronze Žižka, completed in 1950 by a communist government that needed nationalist heroes more than it needed historical accuracy. The statue shows him leading cavalry charges he never personally led, looking at horizons he never saw, embodying heroism that would have made the real Žižka pragmatic, brutal, unsentimental, laugh bitterly. The wagon fortresses became museum curiosities. Military historians studied Žižka's tactics as precursors to modern combined arms warfare, infantry, artillery, and mobile defense integrated into systematic doctrine. They weren't wrong. His innovations influenced military thinking for centuries, but reducing him to tactical footnote erases the horror of what he actually did. Taught peasants that nobility wasn't divinely ordained, just better equipped. That lesson was far more dangerous than any battle tactic. Historians still debate whether Žižka was military genius, religious zealot, or opportunistic mercenary who found cause that matched his skills. The answer is probably all three, and none. He was competence weaponized, discipline made flesh, a man who reduced warfare to mathematics, and then became the equation's casualty. The Hussite Wars ended exactly as he'd feared they would, with compromise that preserved most of the structures he'd fought against. The Catholic Church retained its power, just slightly reformed. The Bohemian nobility retained their titles and lands. The peasants who'd learned to kill knights went back to being peasants, and their children forgot what equality felt like. The revolution succeeded militarily and failed politically. The Crusades were defeated, but the social order survived. Žižka proved that peasants could beat knights, and the system responded by making sure peasants never again had generals competent enough to organise them. His legacy became warning as much as inspiration. This is what happens when you let competence override hierarchy. This is what happens when you teach the wrong people that the social order is just metal and meat, not divine mandate. This is what happens when blind men see too clearly. The drums, whether made from his skin or legend, fell silent. The wagon fortresses rotted. The soldiers who'd followed him died unremarked, and the name Žižka became symbol detached from the complicated, brutal human reality. Jan Žižka of Trocnov died of plague in 1424. The Hussite wars he dominated continued 7 more years without him. The church he fought survived. The nobility he terrorized retained power. The revolution he enabled consumed itself. Bohemia endured, the system endured, and the man who proved peasants could butcher crusades became a statue on a hill, frozen in bronze heroism, eyes that never worked staring at horizons that never changed. They built monuments, they didn't build graves, and in the space where his bones should rest there's only silence and the faint echo of drums that maybe never existed at all.